Welcome to your deep dive. Looks like we're diving into Brené Brown's work on vulnerability and shame today. We've got a transcript from her YouTube video, Daring Greatly. What strikes you about how Brown describes the feeling of vulnerability?
I think the first thing is she doesn't try to dress it up or anything. She goes right to that raw, uh, almost like excruciating feeling of putting yourself out there.
Yeah, it's definitely not like a warm and fuzzy feeling, right? It's about courage when it's uncomfortable.
Right. And it's interesting how she talks about her own experiences,
Yeah.
like her TED Talk going viral and all the research she did. It really shows how vulnerability isn't just some idea. It's something we all kind of deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And she dives right into shame, too. I mean,
Mhm.
her definition of shame is pretty intense, right? She says it's that intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging.
Wow. Yeah, that's heavy.
It is, and it makes you think about how much believing we're unworthy impacts how we connect with others.
That's a great point. And that's probably why she spent so much time debunking myths about vulnerability. Like the first one, vulnerability equals weakness. She completely turns that around.
So how does she do that? What does she say?
She shows how vulnerability is actually where courage and joy and even creativity come from.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not just like feel-good stuff either. She's got research to back it up.
Oh, I know. What are some of the findings that really stand out to you?
Well, her work with men is really fascinating. She found that men are often raised to kind of suppress vulnerability, and that ends up limiting their ability to connect deeply and express their emotions.
It's like we tell them to just man up and hide how they feel, which kind of goes with that second myth that we can go it alone.
Right, exactly. Brown's like, nope, not a chance. We need those support systems to be brave and show up as our true selves.
I love that it's like she's giving us permission to be human.
Totally. And not just individually, but together too. Like she has this great example from Harvard Business Review about a CEO named Clinton. He admitted to his whole team about his failures.
Wow, that's brave.
Right. And that vulnerability actually created this wave of innovation and initiative in the company. Brown calls it the snowball effect.
So being vulnerable can actually inspire others to be vulnerable too. It makes you think about the leaders in your own life, how their vulnerability or lack of it shapes things around them.
For sure, it's a reminder that vulnerability isn't just a personal thing. It impacts our relationships, families, and workplaces too.
Which brings us to myth number 3, that trust doesn't require vulnerability.
Right, but Brown's research shows that trust is actually built on vulnerability. It's like a marble jar, slowly filling up with each active connection.
I love that analogy. So understanding these myths is so important. It helps us challenge those limiting beliefs in our own lives.
Absolutely. And so then the question becomes, how do we face that ultimate gremlin, shame?
Right, because if we're terrified of being judged, we can't really be seen.
And that's where Brown introduces this idea of shame resilience.
Okay, so what is that exactly?
Basically, it's like training to be a gremlin ninja warrior.
I love it.
Yeah, she actually uses this Harry Potter allegory to explain it. She compares shame to Voldemort, the ultimate bad guy. And shame resilience is like the skills Harry and his friends use to fight against the dark arts.
That's a great way to make it more approachable, especially for those of us who are still waiting for our Hogwarts letters.
Exactly. So she outlines these 4 elements of shame resilience: recognizing shame, practicing critical awareness, reaching out for support, and speaking shame.
Okay, so can you give us a quick breakdown of each of those elements?
Sure. So recognizing shame is all about being able to identify when shame is present in our lives. It's about paying attention to our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and noticing when we start to feel small, unworthy, or disconnected.
So if we can name it, we can tame it.
Exactly. And once we can recognize shame, we can practice critical awareness, which is all about questioning the messages that shame is sending us and realizing that those messages aren't necessarily true.
So challenging those negative thought patterns.
Right. And then reaching out for support is huge. When we're struggling with shame, it's so important to connect with people who love and support us unconditionally.
It's like having a strong support system is key to developing shame resilience.
Absolutely. And finally, we have speaking shame. This is about being willing to talk about our experiences with shame, both with ourselves and with others.
Because when we keep shame hidden, it just grows stronger.
Exactly. When we bring it out into the light, it loses its power.
So it's about breaking the silence and the stigma around shame.
Right. These 4 elements of shame resilience are like the tools in our gremlin ninja warrior arsenal.
I love that.
Yeah, by developing these skills, we can learn to recognize shame, challenge its messages, reach out for support and speak our truth.
So we're not letting shame control us. We're learning to manage it and move forward with courage. Now, Brown talks about one major cultural influence on shame, and that's scarcity.
Yeah, the never enough problem. It's
Mhm.
not just about material lack. It's this feeling that love, safety, time, even joy itself is limited.
It's like we're constantly being told we need more, more, more.
Right. And that can be really crippling. It makes us afraid to be seen to own our flaws. Because what if it's not enough? What if we get rejected?
That fear of not being enough is something I think everyone struggles with at some point.
I agree. But Brown says something really interesting. She says the people who have experienced the most profound loss often have the deepest understanding of joy.
What? Really? How does that make
It's a
sense?
powerful paradox, right?
Yeah.
She learned 3 essential lessons about joy from these people. First, joy comes to us in ordinary moments. We can't be so busy chasing extraordinary experiences that we miss the simple joys right in front of us.
So we need to slow down and appreciate the present moment.
Exactly. Second, if you have something beautiful in your life, celebrate it. Don't apologize for it. Don't take it for granted. Share your gratitude with others.
It's about savoring the good stuff, even when it feels vulnerable.
Right? And finally, don't squander joy. You can't prepare for tragedy by turning every happy moment into a potential disaster. Softening into joy, even though it feels vulnerable, actually builds resilience.
Those are some powerful lessons. It makes you think about how a scarcity mindset might be impacting our relationships, our work, even our ability to experience joy.
Yet we have to ask ourselves, are we so focused on what we lack that we're missing out on the abundance that's already in our lives?
That's a great question, something I'll definitely be thinking about. Okay, so we've talked about the problem scarcity and the antidote joy, but how do we actually start taking off that vulnerability armor?
Well, Brown identifies several ways we try to protect ourselves from vulnerability that end up hurting us more. She calls them shields.
Okay, I'm ready to learn how to dismantle those shields.
So one of the most common shields is floodlighting. It's when we dump all our emotional baggage on someone without considering if they can even handle it.
Oh, I've definitely been on the receiving end of that one. It can be
Oh.
so overwhelming and it creates distance instead of connection.
Exactly. It often backfires because it's not about genuine connection. It's about seeking validation or relief from our own discomfort.
So it's important to be mindful of how and when we share vulnerable information.
Right, vulnerability with boundaries is key. We need to be sensitive to the other person's capacity to receive what we're sharing.
That makes sense. So what's another common shield we should watch out for?
Well, another one is the smash and grab. It's like when someone uses vulnerability to get attention or sympathy, not really for genuine connection.
So it's not about real connection. It's more about using vulnerability to get something. How can you tell when that's happening?
It just feels kind of fake and one-sided. The person sharing isn't really interested in connecting. They're more focused on getting a certain reaction from the other person.
Like vulnerability as a performance almost. It feels kind of manipulative.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's serpentining. It's what Brown calls it when we just totally avoid vulnerability, like dodging difficult situations and conversations. She actually uses this hilarious scene from the movie The In-Laws to describe it.
Wait, is that the one where they're running from the snipers? And the dentist keeps yelling, serpentine, serpentine.
That's the one. It's that feeling of just frantically trying to avoid anything uncomfortable. We avoid conflict. We back out of situations. We pretend everything's fine when it's not. It can be exhausting.
Yeah, it sounds exhausting, and it probably doesn't work very well in the long run. What happens when you keep serpentining?
Well, it can lead to all sorts of unhealthy behaviors,
Oh.
like procrastination, blaming others, even lying. In the end, facing our fears head on is actually the braver option.
So dodging vulnerability just creates more problems later on. What about that last shield, cynicism and criticism?
Ah, yes, the weapons of the detached and disengaged. We use them to distance ourselves from others to avoid the risk of getting hurt or disappointed.
It's always easier to tear things down than build them up, isn't it?
It can be, but here's the thing. Feedback is essential for growth, both personally and professionally. So we have to find a way to give and receive feedback honestly and constructively without being cynical or cruel.
So it's about finding that balance between honesty and kindness.
Exactly. It's a tightrope walk, for sure. But if we want to dare greatly, we have to learn how to walk it.
Absolutely. All right, so are you ready to shift gears a little bit and talk about how all of this applies to the professional world? Brown's research actually has a lot to say about vulnerability in education and work.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how it all plays out in those settings.
Okay, great. So what does she say about vulnerability at work?
Well, one of her big findings is this idea of the disengagement divide.
Yeah.
It happens when leadership doesn't really live up to their end of the social contract, you know?
What do you mean by the social contract?
Like people start checking out because they don't feel seen, heard, or valued.
So it's not just individuals being afraid to be vulnerable, it's about systems that discourage vulnerability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Brown uses the examples of politics and religion, where leaders often say one thing but do another.
Right. It creates that disconnect and people lose trust.
Right. It's like that saying, people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses.
That's so true. I've totally felt that disengagement when I felt like my leaders weren't walking the talk. How does that disengagement divide impact feedback culture then?
Well, it can lead to this toxic feedback culture
Yeah.
where people are more focused on protecting themselves than learning and growing.
Like everyone's walking on eggshells, afraid to speak up or make a mistake.
Exactly. Brown tells this story about Sylvia, an event planner. Her boss was constantly criticizing her in public. It destroyed her confidence, and she ended up leaving the company.
It's like that fear-based culture just crushes creativity and innovation. If you're always worried about getting criticized, you're not going to take risks or share new ideas.
Right. And that's where Brown's idea of disruptive engagement comes in. She says we have to be willing to shake things up and challenge the status quo if we want to create a more humane and fulfilling work environment.
It sounds like a call to action to be authentic and challenge the norms that aren't working anymore.
Exactly. And it starts with looking at our own relationship with vulnerability.
I like that. So how do we actually go about being more disruptive?
Well, Brown offers a really powerful alternative to that fear-based approach. It's about reframing limitations as strengths. Instead of focusing on what we lack, she encourages us to identify our core values and strengths, and then find ways to leverage those, even when we face challenges.
So it's not about denying our weaknesses, it's about understanding how they relate to our strengths and using that knowledge to our advantage.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we're already enough just as we are. And when we embrace that truth, we can show up with more confidence and authenticity in our work.
That's such a great message now, given the source material you provided.
Yeah.
I think we should spend some time talking about Brown's Wholehearted Parenting Manifesto, even if we're not parents ourselves. I'm sure there are valuable insights that apply to any kind of relationship.
Absolutely. Brown's main message is that who we are as people matters more than our parenting knowledge. It's a challenge to that expert obsession so many parents face. Like, they need to have all the answers all the time.
So it's less about following a script and more about modeling vulnerability and authenticity for our kids.
Exactly. Brown gives some really touching examples of this, like Susan talking to her son about how hurtful words made her feel, and letting her daughter Ellen swim her race, even though she was going to be the slowest one. They're not these grand gestures. They're everyday moments of showing up authentically.
Those stories are so powerful. They really highlight how vulnerability can create connection and build resilience in families. It's not about being perfect, it's about being real.
And that's the essence of Brown's Wholehearted Parenting Manifesto. It's a set of guidelines for raising children who are brave, compassionate, and connected to themselves and the world around them.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach either. The listener can actually rewrite the manifesto to reflect their own values and create their own family culture.
That's a great takeaway. And speaking of shields we've talked about, Brown identifies another one that could be really sneaky. It's called foreboding joy.
Foreboding joy, what's that?
It's that thing where you're having a happy moment, but instead of enjoying it, you start worrying about when it's going to end.
Oh yeah, I've totally felt that. It's like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Exactly. It's a common response to living in a scarcity culture. We're afraid to let ourselves be too happy because we don't believe we deserve it, or we're afraid it won't last.
So we end up minimizing our own joy to protect ourselves from future disappointment.
Right. But Brown says that joy is actually an act of resistance against scarcity. It's a way of saying, I deserve to experience happiness, and I'm going to savor every moment of it.
Okay, so next time I catch myself foreboding joy, I'm going to try to shift my focus to gratitude instead. Appreciate the moment for what it is, rather than worrying about what might happen next.
I love that gratitude is a powerful antidote to scarcity. It helps us to appreciate what we have rather than focusing on what we lack.
It's about shifting our perspective.
Exactly. And Brown also talks about perfectionism as another shield,
Oh yeah, we all know that one.
right? The never-ending quest to be flawless. Brown actually calls it a self-destructive and addictive belief system that keeps us from experiencing true connection and joy.
Because we're always striving for this impossible goal, and when we inevitably fall short, we feel inadequate and ashamed.
Exactly. And the irony is perfectionism doesn't actually protect us from shame. It just perpetuates it.
She has this great definition of perfectionism. She says it's the belief that if we do things perfectly and look perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. So it's not about striving for excellence, it's about trying to control how others see us.
Exactly. And when we try to control how others perceive us, we end up being exhausted, resentful, and disconnected from ourselves and others. We lose sight of who we truly are.
It's like we're wearing a mask all the time, trying to present this perfect image to the world. But it's so exhausting and it prevents us from experiencing real connection.
Right. So instead of striving for perfection, Brown suggests that we focus on being good enough.
Okay, but that doesn't mean settling for mediocrity, right? What does good enough actually look like?
It means accepting that we are all imperfect and that our imperfections are part of what makes us unique and lovable. It's about embracing our humanity with all its flaws and quirks.
I think that's something we all need to hear more often.
I agree, especially in a culture that's obsessed with this idea of airbrushed perfection.
And this idea of good enough extends to our relationships too, right?
Absolutely. Brown talks about how we often try to protect ourselves from vulnerability by numbing our emotions.
Numbing, yeah, that's a big one. How do we do that?
It can take a lot of different forms. We might stay constantly busy and overwork ourselves. We might rely on substances like alcohol or drugs to soothe our emotional pain. We might even distract ourselves with endless scrolling on social media.
It's like we're trying to avoid feeling anything at all because feeling anything feels too risky.
Exactly. But the problem is when we numb the negative emotions, we also numb the positive ones. We end up feeling disconnected from ourselves and others. And it becomes really hard to experience true joy or connection.
Brown talks about how anxiety and disconnection are major drivers of numbing. It's like we're so overwhelmed by everything that we just shut down emotionally. Are there any other reasons we might numb ourselves?
Sometimes it's a way of coping with past trauma or difficult experiences. We might numb ourselves to avoid feeling the pain of those memories.
It makes sense that numbing would be a way to protect ourselves from pain, but it ends up preventing us from really living our lives.
Exactly, and Brown identifies two main groups of people when it comes to anxiety. Those who try to power through it by staying busy and overachieving, and those who try to avoid it by withdrawing and isolating themselves.
Neither one of those sounds very healthy.
No, they're both coping mechanisms that ultimately prevent us from fully engaging with our lives. Brown argues that the key to overcoming anxiety is to learn how to set boundaries and say no to the things that drain us, so we can create space for the things that matter most.
So it's about reclaiming our time and energy and investing it in the things that bring us joy and fulfillment.
Exactly, and that requires a willingness to be vulnerable, to admit that we can't do it all, and to ask for help when we need it.
Which brings us back to connection. Brown defines connection as the energy that is created between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued.
It's about creating a space where people feel safe to be their authentic selves, without fear of judgment or rejection.
And she makes a really important distinction between fitting in and belonging.
That's so crucial. Fitting in is about conforming to what other people expect, while belonging is about being accepted for who we are, flaws and all.
I love how Brown describes belonging as the innate human desire to be part of something larger than us. It's something we all crave, but we often go about it in the wrong way.
Yeah, we try to earn belonging through achievements or by trying to be someone we're not. But true belonging comes from embracing our imperfections and allowing ourselves to be seen for who we truly are.
Brown shares a story about her daughter Ellen feeling like the other at school. Can you tell us a bit about that story and what it reveals about belonging?
Yeah, it's a really relatable story. Ellen was struggling to fit in at her new school, and she felt like she didn't have anyone to talk to. Brown, being a mom, wanted to fix it for her.
It's that natural instinct to want to shield our kids from pain.
Exactly. But sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen and offer support.
And that's what Brown did right.
Yeah, she sat down with Ellen and listened to her story. And as Ellen was talking, Brown realized that she had felt like the other at times too.
So that shared experience of vulnerability created a deeper connection between them.
Yes, it was a really beautiful moment. It reminded them that they weren't alone in their struggles.
It's a reminder that vulnerability can be a bridge to connection even in unexpected places. And it's especially relevant for leaders who are trying to create a more inclusive and engaging culture.
Absolutely. And Brain talks about how leaders often try to protect themselves from vulnerability
Yeah.
by adopting a Viking or victim mentality.
So they either try to dominate and control others, the Viking, or they feel powerless and victimized by circumstances, the victim.
Exactly. And neither approach allows for genuine connection or collaboration.
Because they're both rooted in fear and a need to protect the ego. It's a very different model of leadership than we usually see, but I think it's one we desperately need.
I agree, and this applies not just to leaders in the traditional sense, but to anyone who's trying to create positive change in their workplace, their community, even their own family.
So, how do we start to shift away from that Viking or victim mentality and embrace vulnerability as leaders?
Well, Brown suggests that we focus on redefining success. Instead of measuring success by external markers like title, salary, or achievements, she encourages us to focus on our values and the impact we're having on the world around us.
It's about finding meaning and purpose in our work and using our influence to make a positive difference.
Exactly. And that requires vulnerability. It requires us to step outside of our comfort zones to take risks and to be okay with not always getting it right.
That can be tough, especially in a culture that values perfection and success.
It is, but the rewards are worth it. When we dare to be vulnerable, we open ourselves up to a whole new world of possibilities.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of Brown's work.
Me too. There's so much to unpack.
Well, maybe we can do another deep dive sometime and explore some of these concepts in more depth.
I love that.
Thanks for joining me today. It's been a pleasure diving into Brené Brown's work with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
Wow, it's amazing how Brown connects all these different parts of wholehearted living, From vulnerability and shame, resilience to joy and connection and even spirituality. But it can feel kind of overwhelming to think about putting all of this into practice. So what does she say about how to actually live these principles every day?
Well, she emphasizes that it's a practice, not a destination. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to keep showing up and doing the work. It's about those small steps each day, to cultivate more vulnerability, courage, and connection in our lives.
So instead of trying to change everything at once, we focus on those small, sustainable changes. What are some examples of those small steps we can take?
One of the most powerful things is just being more honest about how we're feeling. Like instead of saying, I'm fine, when we're actually stressed or overwhelmed, we can try saying, I'm having a tough day, or I could really use some support.
It's about letting people see our humanity even when it's messy.
Exactly. And it gives other people permission to do the same. When we model authenticity, we create space for more genuine connections.
It reminds me of that story Brown tells about feeling really vulnerable after giving a talk at a conference.
Oh yeah, what happened?
She was full of self-doubt after the talk, like questioning whether she said the right things or connected with the audience, and she just wanted to retreat and avoid all those feelings of vulnerability.
It's that natural instinct to protect ourselves when we feel exposed.
Right, but then something really interesting happened.
Was that?
This young man came up to her and said, "The only reason we listen to you is because you're just as bad at being open as we are. If you didn't wrestle with vulnerability, we wouldn't trust you one bit."
Wow, that's powerful.
It is, right? It shows how our imperfections can actually make us more relatable and trustworthy.
Absolutely. That moment was a real turning point for Brown. She realized that her vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was her superpower. It allowed her to connect with people in a deep and meaningful way.
It makes you think about all the connections we miss out on when we try to present a perfect image to the world.
Totally. We miss out on the genuine connections that make life so much richer.
And Brown talks about the importance of surrounding ourselves with people who support us on that journey, people who love and accept us unconditionally even when we're struggling. She calls them our people.
Yeah, those are the people we can be ourselves with, without fear of judgment or rejection, the ones who remind us of our worthiness, even when we forget.
Exactly. And they encourage us to dare greatly to step outside of our comfort zones, to live a life that is true to ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure diving into Brené Brown's work with you today.
Likewise, I feel like this deep dive has given us a lot to think about and a lot of tools to start embracing vulnerability and daring greatly in our own lives.
For sure, vulnerability is definitely not the enemy.
No, it's a superpower that can unlock a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
It's the key to deeper connections, greater creativity, and a more joyful experience of the world.
And it's something we can all cultivate with intention and support every single day.
So what are you waiting for?
Go out there and dare greatly.